On t'écoute, Vincent.
Welcome. As Sylvain said, my study will be about tourism in Pacific Islands. For those of you who were at CATEM workshop, it sounds like a similar study, except it has been revamped, improved with better data, and I'll show that in a moment. First of all, I'd like to remind about the small island paradox, which means that most small island economies need tourism to grow, external growth. However, they have handicaps, as we all know, such as remoteness and smallness. So those challenges, we're going to study them with a graffiti model. First of all, some key statistics. As you can see here from this diagram, most islands, basically 2/3 of the islands, have over 20% of the GDP, gross domestic product, based on tourism, right here, including, for instance, Fiji, 20%, Samoa, etc. So clearly, tourism is an important source of revenues. Recently, a study from the World Bank focused on those Pacific islands and Pacific opportunities called Pacific Possible, and actually quantified the benefits from tourism, from growth from tourism, in particular from China, with an expected gain of about 65,000 jobs all over the Pacific Islands. A little bit less, but nevertheless interesting, from cruise ships, from a high-end resort market, 30,000, and for capturing the retiree market. Overall, almost 200,000 jobs are potentially available by developing tourism, some kind of tourism, China, etc., to those Pacific islands. And of course, that would lead to an additional $1.7 billion US in revenues, not negligible. So based on those remarks, I try to understand a little bit. I try to look a little more in the details. And if you look at this table, and we're not going to look at all the results, don't worry. We can see that, for instance, this last column identifies the per capita tourism receipts. That means how much, on average, each island receives from tourism revenues per person, per inhabitant. And of course, on top, you can see islands like Hawaii, Guam, followed by, those are Pacific islands. There are many more other islands in the world, but I just focused, obviously, today on Pacific islands. And Palau, which all of them around $10,000 per person. This is a huge amount. And then you see a drop, an immediate drop to New Zealand, French Polynesia, Fiji, about $1,000 to $2,000. And unfortunately, for other islands, which are here, it's below $1,000. Just for information, most of the islands which are in the Caribbean regions, they are about $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. So there are still improvements, obviously, to be made for most of the Pacific islands to attract a lot of tourism and earn a lot of revenue. Another key ratio is also the number of tourists per inhabitant. As you see, Hawaii and Guam have about 6 to 8 tourists per person, per resident, which is a huge amount, maybe too much, some would say. There are problems right now in Hawaii. But if you look at the next countries, they all fall below 1, below unity. So clearly there is perhaps a strategy there. Should we go toward high-end markets, or should we go towards quantities like Hawaii? Obviously, this is the question to be debated. But nevertheless, the challenge or challenges that the SIDS, the small island developing states, face have been analyzed before, in particular by the World Bank in 2009, and there are three, the 3 Ds. First, distance. Most islands, as you know, are very remote. Less in the Caribbean, but more, of course, in the Pacific region. Number 2, density. There are small economies. And of course, small economies mean small economies of scale, and therefore high prices, high costs. And third, which is very often forgotten, protectionism, divisions. And that will come to that later on. So if you look at the map, roughly, of distances and cost of airlines, in the Pacific region, you see that obviously this is a major handicap, the small size also. And this handicap, you can see it also in terms of connections and high cost. For developing countries, there's an index here of 25 roughly, which is the easiness of being connected through ships, connected through internet, etc., etc. And unfortunately, for Pacific Islands, we're around 5, 6, 10, no more. So there's still progress to be made, obviously, with that regards. So come back to the study. The questions we're going to ask in this study is how sensitive are tourism flow, bilateral tourism flows, to those handicaps, large distances, low GDP in islands, large GDP in other countries, and to other economic, political, and cultural proximity variables. The second question we're going to ask is there a difference between islands and other countries in the world in terms of those elasticities, those reactions? And the third and last question is, what are the potential optimal strategies to overcome those challenges, especially for Pacific Islands? So very quickly, the gravity model, for those of you that like mathematics, this is a very simple equation, of course. That means that economic masses attract each other. When you have a big market like planets, obviously you have a lot of customers. So obviously this is a source of attraction and therefore trade. And we can of course expand that to tourism. Those are the mass, basically variables, the mass of the country from which the tourists come from, and the mass of the destination countries. Here, Pacific Islands. And D is the distance. And obviously it's negatively related to commerce, to trade, and therefore to tourism. The further you are, the more costly it is, the longer the flights are, and therefore the less tourists you have. So this is a simplistic equation which we improve, basically, we augment with other variables. So I'm not going to bore you with too many details about that, but those explanatory variables are the distance, as I said, between two countries. We have a panel data about 170 countries, and when you double that, and you have about 100,000 observations over a period of 20 years. The second data, of course, is the multilateral distance. It's a bit complex to explain, but very quickly, if you live, for instance, in Australia, well, every country is far from you. So whether you go to Europe or to the US or to Asia, doesn't matter, it's far. So actually, this is a little bit a counter tendency from the first one. The second variables which I've mentioned is of course GDP, the economic mass of the country, either the country of the origin of the tourist or the destination, and other variables are important such as the price ratio, the real exchange rate in technical terms, which means how more expensive it is to travel to one country such as French Polynesia, where the cost of living is very, very high, compared at least to other places in the world. But other ratios, other dummy variables, other variables that are interesting, such as the monetary proximity, whether you have the same currency, whether you share the same currency or not. For instance, Hawaii has a lot of American tourists. One of the reasons is, well, you don't have to change currency. It's the US dollar, which is easy to use. You have also the common language dummy, for obviously same, or maybe not same, but similar culture, similar common language, also perhaps similar religion. Maybe all those facts can attract more tourists. And to complete this list, we have this dummy, 1 for past colonization, 0 if there was never any colonization link, which obviously can be useful. So the data, let's go very fast over those details. We have 174 countries, almost 10,000 observations. And when you multiply them by 25 years or 20 years of data, that means 100,000 variables. But within those, we're going to identify 32 small islands and about 1,000 observations. And therefore, we're going to use two kinds of techniques: cross-country data for the latest year that we have, 2015, and which is new, panel data over a 20-year period. Okay. Let's go to the results without being too technical. When you have a negative sign here, that means that this variable acts negatively on the flow of tourists. And when it's positive, of course, there's a positive relationship. When you have little stars here, those are economic notation. That means highly significant. When you have no star, it's not significant. And here, it's the difference, stars or no stars, between basically tourists from the world, or, sorry, tourism to certain destinations of the world, or tourism to small islands only. So I can look at the difference between the reaction of the consumers, of the tourists, to all those variables, depending whether they go to Europe, for instance, or US, or whether they go to the Pacific Islands, which I've mentioned before. So we have two kinds of basically techniques, results. I'm not going to go over that. I'm going to go to another table which simplifies a little bit the explanation of all that. What you can see is that, nevertheless, this explains a very high share of all the variation, from 80 to almost 99%. It's quite surprising. That means the model works quite well. So I think this table is simpler to understand. Let's say you double the destination between two countries. Let's say Hawaii is 50, or Tahiti is 50% further from Los Angeles than from Hawaii. Well, thank you. If you double this distance, for instance, perhaps Fiji to Los Angeles instead of Hawaii to Los Angeles, roughly, what will happen to the flow of tourism between those two destinations? Well, it will drop by about 2/3, minus 70%, whether it's an island or not. The second and third variables are the economic masses. You remember in the gravity model? That means that if in the origin country, the country from which the tourists come from, you double GDP, the wealth, in this case, you're going to increase by also 70 to 80% the number of tourists. In terms of the destination country, and that's important. If, for instance, GDP doubles in French Polynesia, which it did from 1960 to 1970 and from 1970 to 1990, well, in this case, that's an opportunity to build infrastructure and to attract more tourists. And we see that it has a significant impact, about, again, 70 to 80%. However, which is the biggest challenge, perhaps, to attract foreign tourists here, and perhaps in some islands, but maybe less? The high costs of living in French Polynesia, you may have noticed. And as a result, if you double the cost, well, in this case, you're going to decrease tourism in major countries by 22%, but by 60% in islands. So that means that the elasticity, the responsiveness of small islands or of tourism to small island costs is very high. Finally, I'm going to comment a little bit and very quickly the other variables which are not typically from the gravity model. What if you have this, you share the same common currency? You increase basically tourism between, let's say, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, because of the euro. But imagine that in French Polynesia, suddenly we adopt the euro. It wouldn't make a difference, honestly, according to those results. What makes a huge difference is sharing a common language. It triples, plus 200%, it triples the number of tourists. And it quadruples the number of tourists if those two countries, the country of destination, the country of origin of the tourist, have the same, have a colonization past. Religion seems a little bit strange to interpret. It has negative impact, sometimes strong, sometimes less strong, so maybe we cannot say too much about that. Okay. So let's conclude very quickly with a little example, tourism in Tahiti and Hawaii. As you see, Tahiti is about 8.5 hours flight from Los Angeles, where I used to live, and Hawaii is about 4.5 hours. So I wouldn't say it's doubling, but multiply by 1.6 roughly. And if you look at all the determinants of this model, we have the same currency in Hawaii. The Hawaiian have the same currency than the states. It is the 50th state, so therefore the same past, the same political past. There are many, many advantages which boost the number of tourism in Hawaii compared to Americans coming to Tahiti. And the result is there are about 6 or 7 tourists per inhabitant in Hawaii. And here in French Polynesia, we have only 0.6, 10 times less tourists per inhabitant. Mostly Americans, mostly Europeans, roughly half and half, and then some from the rest of the world. So what are the consequences of this study, and what are the proposals to improve tourism? Well, the conclusion is the following, are threefold. First of all, as you have seen, remoteness and small size are major challenges for this tourism development, which is nevertheless absolutely necessary. Second of all, tourism development in the Pacific countries could benefit from some countries like China, which are in a period of fast growth for the last 20 years, or perhaps from niches, high-end retired tourists from rich countries. Maybe that's a strategy to follow. But finally, this gravity model is not perfect, of course. There are many non-quantifiable, unquantified latent factors. For instance, the fact that we have Tetiaroa, which used to belong to Marlon Brando, the fact that they were Americans during the war in Bora Bora. All those things cannot be easily quantified in model. So that means that there's still hope to improve excuse me, tourism in Pacific Islands. In Palau, there are tons of planes and where you can see by diving, for instance, which attract tons of tourists. In Rangiora, a lot of sharks. There was just yesterday, I don't know if you saw, a magnificent report on those 700 sharks which populates basically the pass of Rangiros. So there are many, many points that are many factors that are not included in this model, of course, which can be included to improve tourism. And to conclude, excuse me if it's not in the correct order, okay? The good news is that we already begin to see this effect from China. Slowly but surely, the number of Chinese tourists to Fiji, to French Polynesia, to Mariana, to Palau is increasing very fast, but very small scale. And the same thing in non-Pacific islands. The bad news is that there are still a lot of economies which are not competitive because of protectionist policies, and that could be changed. Thank you very much. Right, finally.
Thank you. On time, so no complaint.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions?